I am born through the storm, through the night. Lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. When the shadows appear and the night draweth near, and the day is past and gone. At the river I stand, guide my feet, hold my hand, take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. Great to see everybody this morning. Appreciate your presence so very, very much. Got a good crowd with us today. We are missing several, and we certainly do note their absence, but we are so very, very grateful for your choosing to come and to be with us today, that we can worship together in spirit and in truth. You know, as you read over passages of Scripture, sometimes you can go over them time and time again, and then you suddenly come on to something that you didn't see was there before. Been there all the way along, but it just didn't seem to flip a switch. It didn't seem to register. Had that happen as I was studying for this lesson this morning. Whenever we look at the story of the temptation of Jesus, as is talked about in the opening chapters of the Gospel of Matthew, you know, we often talk about the very powerful temptations that Satan threw before Jesus. And we kind of put together the pieces as to what all was the setting. How that he had been, in verse 2 of Matthew chapter 4, he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. He was very hungry. It was in this weakened state that Satan came to tempt him. And of course, this is what Peter talks about. It's consistent with Satan's tactics. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8, he talks about him being like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. He's on the hunt. And so he's going to work to find us at a time that we are the weakest. And so it was here as he attempts to seduce Jesus into caving into these temptations. The temptations are very powerful in their own right. You know, he's been fasting for 40 days, and his first temptation will take, these stones and make them bread. Use your divine power and feed yourself. But of course, Jesus knew that would forever after make a barrier, looking to the idea that he could always just kind of snap his fingers and miraculously take care of his needs when the rest of the human family didn't have that ability. And so he reminds him that this is not the way that it's going to go. Man doesn't live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. We find then that he takes him up on a pinnacle of the temple as we go down to verse 5 of Matthew chapter 4. And, wants him to jump off, because he quotes a passage saying that God would be protector, that the angels would look after him, and this sort of thing. And so he's wanting to kind of say, prove it. Prove that you are as powerful as you say that you are. And Jesus simply answers him, saying, it is written, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God. And then that third temptation was to take him up into a high mountain and show him the kingdoms of the world. And he says, look, it's just you and me up here in this mountain. If you'll fall down and worship me, then I will get out of your way, and I will let you have dominion over all these kingdoms of the world. You can have all of the glory from that, but all you have to do is worship me here on this mountaintop, and then you won't have all the struggle that you're going to be facing from my opposition any other way. And Jesus said, thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only thou shalt serve, in verse 10 of Matthew chapter 4. Now, in verse 11, it says, then the devil leaveth him, and behold, the angels came and ministered unto him. And that's the way Matthew's account ends, and that's pretty well where my mind switched off. We get to the end of the temptations. He's victorious over these temptations. He answers Satan on every turn. And so, it's over with, and we go on to the next set of adventures. And soon he's preaching his Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew. But Luke's account adds one little phrase at the end of this in Luke chapter 4 and going down to verse 13 as to what happened whenever the devil left Jesus for a time. It says in verse 13, and when the devil had ended all the temptations, he departed from him for a season. Now, whenever you look at that in the English Standard Version and some others, it says that he left him awaiting an opportune time. In other words, he wasn't done with the temptations that Jesus was going to have to endure. He wasn't going to say, well, you didn't cooperate these 3 times, so I guess I'll leave you alone. He only backed away temporarily. He left him for a season, the old King James says. But he was waiting for an opportune time to come back and do what else he could do to tempt Jesus. So in other words, the points being made is that he kept working. Whenever we start looking at the efforts that Satan puts forth here, Satan is going to continue to do everything that he can to thwart the work of Jesus and to make him less than perfect. And he was going to use whatever avenue was going to be to his advantage. He even used one of Jesus' best friends to try to tempt him into changing his course of action. Over in Mark chapter 8 and going down to verse 31, we find here that Jesus is beginning to prepare the people for what was going to come to pass and the horrible death that he was going to die. And in Mark chapter 8 and beginning in verse 31, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected of the elders and of the chief priests and scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he spake that saying openly. And Peter took him and began to rebuke him. But when he had turned about and looked on his disciples, he rebuked Peter, saying, Get thee behind me, Satan, for thou savorest not the things that be of God, but the things that be of men. Peter was basically saying, you don't have to do this. You don't have to die like that. Don't be so negative. Don't talk in such fatalistic terms. You don't have to go to the cross. That doesn't have to be the course of action. Of course, Jesus knew the big picture. He knew that that was why he was sent into the world. That this was the point of his coming, that he might be the sacrificial lamb for the whole world. But Peter, one of his disciples, one of his close friends, is saying, no, 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 no. This crucifixion thing doesn't have to happen. And he says, get thee behind me, Satan. Basically, the words that Peter were speaking, the influence that Peter was trying to exert on Jesus, was counter to what God wanted Jesus to do. It was another form of temptation to get him to turn away from the mission that his Father had given him to fulfill. And so even in straightening out things with his apostles, there were voices saying, you don't have to do the Father's will. There are other options, you know. And Jesus had to withstand that and to correct Peter. The Pharisees were constantly trying to get Jesus into trouble and to find some way in which imperfection could be highlighted in him. Over in Matthew chapter 19, we find on this occasion that they are asking that loaded question, a very socially, hot issue about divorce and remarriage. And we notice why they asked it here in Matthew chapter 19 and verse 3. The Pharisees also came unto him, tempting him, and saying unto him, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? The whole point was they didn't want to know his answer necessarily, only they wanted to see if he would say something that would alienate him from the crowds. Or would he say something that would be contradictory to the law of Moses? Could they get him to make a mistake? Could they find a fault in him? And they did this over and over and over. Over in Matthew chapter 22, and going down to verse 34, we find that Jesus has been tested here by the Sadducees, and he had answered their inquiries. So now the Pharisees tried their hand at it. In Matthew chapter 22 and beginning in verse 34, and when the Pharisees had heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, they were gathered together. And then one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him and saying, Master, which is the greatest commandment in the law? There was a whole point to that loaded question. To say something that would not be the conventional wisdom. To say something that was not the common understanding. To pick up on something that might be used against Jesus in a critical kind of way. Jesus had these kinds of tests besetting him day in and day out during the years of his personal ministry. Over in Luke chapter 20, we find going down to about verse 19. Once again, it says, the chief priests and the scribes, the same hour, sought to lay hands on him. But they feared the people, for they perceived that he had spoken this parable against them. And they watched him. And they sent for spies, who should feign themselves just men, that they might take hold of his words, so that they might deliver him under the power and authority of the governor. So here we see the kind of audience, or a component of the audiences that Jesus worked with. And they just kept on, and they kept on, and they kept on. In fact, even as Jesus was hanging on the cross, there were temptations thrown before him. Over in Matthew chapter 27, and going down to verse 39, we find that Jesus has now been crucified. And notice the reaction of those who walked by, seeing the things that had happened. Here in Matthew chapter 27 and verse 39. And they that passed by reviled him, wagging their heads, and saying, Thou that destroyedest the temple and buildest it in 3 days, save thyself. If thou be the Son of God, come down from the cross. Likewise also the chief priests, mocking him, with the scribes and elders, said, He saved others, himself he cannot save. If he be the King of Israel, let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe him. He trusted in God, let him deliver him now, if he'll have him. For he said, I am the Son of God. And the thieves also, which were crucified with him, cast the same in his teeth. So even as Jesus was dying, there was the temptation to stop the pain, to come down from the cross, prove right here and now that you are the Son of God, and that you've got power over death, and that you can fulfill all these things that you're saying. Satan just kept working. In every weakened state, in every possible context, he was looking for an opportunity to see Jesus fall short. But the Hebrew writer tells us over in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15 that even though this temptation was ongoing, there was one thing after another, Jesus handled it all. In Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15, for we have not a high priest which cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted, like as we are, yet without sin. So here we see the perpetual nature that Satan has. Here is the Son of God, and over and over and over again, temptations were issued to the Lord to do that which would be displeasing to your Father in heaven. Well, the same point applies to us. He is after us as well. He is going to keep watching for opportunities to see what he can do, to find some season in our lives when we're going to be susceptible to the kind of temptation that he engineers. Over in 2 Timothy chapter 2, and going down to verse 22, Paul gives an admonition to the young preacher Timothy. He says, flee also youthful lusts, but follow righteousness and faith, charity and peace, with them that call on the Lord out of a pure conscience. Yes, there are many temptations that we face in our youth when we haven't yet developed maybe the experience base to see where certain decisions might take us. And that's why we need to kind of take a special look at the things that we say and do, lest we allow ourselves to be pulled into situations where we're soon in over our head, and where we cave in to the lustful passion of youth, and to some of the actions of immorality and other such that individuals at that stage in life may be most susceptible to. But you see, youthful lusts and the whole problem of lust does not just stop at that youthful stage. You know, as we begin to get older, we also develop different affections for things that are inappropriate. It may be that as we get older and we become more attuned to the professional world, money becomes the all-important drawing card. That I want to be so busy with the affairs of this life that religious service to God slides into the background. Maybe it's the idea of I have a thirsting for power. I want to be the boss. I want to be the one that's going to control other people and tell them what to do. And so I will do whatever it takes to get to that position in life. It may be that we have that dream and desire that we want to be somebody, and that we want to live in the special neighborhoods and have the special status and be looked at as somewhat the country club set or whatever. Those people that are looked up to in a community as being the supposed pillars in the community and the most successful amongst us. And so we want that as well. Or it may be that as we're moving through the middle stages of our lives, we begin to see ourselves slowly slowing down a little, realizing some of the ravages of age, and we're not ready for that yet. And sometimes they've coined the phrase midlife crisis. And so all of a sudden, we want to prove that we're young again, and so we began to be involved with folks that we shouldn't be involved with. We wind up doing things that are inappropriate all because we're trying to prove something to ourselves and others. And in all of those situations, service of God slides to the bottom of the list. It's all about me and what I'm lusting to do and what I want. And it doesn't stop there. As we grow older, we now begin to look back over our lives. And we see areas where we didn't accomplish some of the things that we wanted to accomplish. And so we began to want to relive our lives through our kids or through others that we can have influence with. We want to find ways to kind of reclaim some youth and to show that we've still got that vim and vigor that we had years ago. Maybe it's just, I realize that my days are running short, and so I need to accumulate all the wealth I can get. And so we become highly covetous, even in our old age. John tells us in 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15, to love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world is the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And it's not of the Father, but it is of the world. And the world passes away in the lust thereof, but he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. Satan waits and watches. We go through these various stages in our lives. But just because maybe we have a long length of service in terms of years in the Lord's kingdom, that doesn't mean that Satan has quit looking for an opportune time to turn you away from God. We find even looking at biblical characters, I think of Eli, an older man. He was a judge in Israel. And God had told him about the mistakes that his kids were making as his boys were corrupted priests. And he told Samuel, I've talked to Eli about this, about the misbehavior of his children, and he restrained them not. And Eli's household was going to perish because sin had set in, and Eli had not done anything to correct it. Over in Luke chapter 12, and going down to verse 15, Jesus talks about that ever-growing desire for wealth, and we want stability, and we want security in our old age or whatever. And so we flat become covetous to hold on and get every dime we can get. We kind of quit praying, forgive us this day our daily bread. We want a whole lot more than that now. But Jesus said in Luke chapter 12 and verse 15, he said unto them, take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's life consists not in the abundance of the things which he possesses. And then he gives us the parable of the rich fool who did have everything, bountiful harvests. But he was so self-centered, it was all about me and my bigger barns and what I can do. And he said, tonight your soul is going to be required of you. And now who is all that stuff going to go to? So he makes the point that we have these issues that are always going to be swirling around us. We never get to reach a point when we are immune from Satan trying to take one more crack, one more effort. Maybe I can get them to let down their guard, and suddenly personality can kind of emerge here, and they're going to become rude, they're going to become mean, they're going to become ugly, they're going to morph into something different than what they've been, all because they think they're entitled to do that. You know, Satan just poisons the water every which way that he can. He's always looking for that opportune time to find us at some stage in life where he is able to find something that will work. You know, there's no coasting here. There's no point in our lives when we can sort of say, all right, I'm done now. Satan will leave me alone, and there's not going to be any more challenges. That's why Paul tells the Ephesians, over in Ephesians chapter 6 and beginning in verse 11, you got to prepare for a constant warfare. And he says, put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. Ephesians chapter 6 and going on in verse 12. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Wherefore take unto you the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. He said, you've got to be ready to do battle with Satan day in and day out. But one of the things that we will soon notice as we watch him and his tactics is that often history will repeat itself. Some of the things that he's tried in the past, he's going to try again. Just because we were victorious one time around doesn't mean that forever after Satan said, oh, shucks, that's not going to work. He said, I'll just be craftier about it next time. I'll hide it a little bit better the next time, because I know man. I know his lusts. I know his desires. And so I'm going to keep after each one of these children of God especially, and see if there's not something I can do to trip them up. You know, Solomon tried to help us understand over in Ecclesiastes chapter 1 that there's nothing new under the sun. There's not going to be some new temptation and problem that we're going to be beset by that hasn't had roots in the past. In Ecclesiastes chapter 1, beginning in verse 9, the thing that hath been, it is that that shall be. And that which is done is that which shall be done. And there is no new thing under the sun. Is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new? It hath been already of old time, which was before us. There is no remembrance of former things, neither shall there be any remembrance of things that are to come with those that shall come after. In other words, we have short memories. We forget some of what we've been through before and some of the battles we've had to fight, and maybe we came out victorious that time. Let's see if they can do it again. And on the cycle repeats itself. We've got to be aware of the next wave. What's going to be his next ploy? You know, right now we think about the pandemic, and we went through the first phase of that, kind of thought we'd gotten around, but now there's kind of been a resurgence of some things. But we should have learned some lessons from the first go-round. Some better preparation. Some things that we know that we can do that can help us out. It may be that we're dealing with health issues. We go through a rough time, and then we get better. And things go on pretty well for a while, and then something else hits. In all of these cases, we can become despondent and discouraged. Here we go again. Here's another mess that I've got to deal with. I thought I was done with this. And right about the time that you think that there's not going to be any more issue, Satan will crank it up again. Maybe he'll want to find some point in your life when maybe earlier on in life you had a stronger sense of right and wrong, and you weren't going to be led off the straight and narrow by anybody else. Somebody may have flirted with you, but you turned that away because you realized where that was going to go. But then when it happens at some other stage in life, it may be more appealing. Things just keep going round and round. Maybe it's business dealings. That we deal with business and things go well, but then we develop some maybe shady practices. We learned that there was a problem there. Maybe we reformed of that for a while, but then things got tight again, and maybe if we cut this corner and that corner, well, it'll be all right. These things can put on a different jacket and come back at us time after time. And the question is, what have we learned? As we've dealt with the temptations, as we've been victorious, or if we have fallen short in the past, the consequences or the victories, what did we learn, and how can we use that to be better prepared this next time when Satan has come for an opportune moment, when he thinks you're not going to be paying close attention? Remember the story that Jesus gave us in the parable of the 5 wise and the 5 foolish virgins over in Matthew chapter 25. And going down to verse 13, he's saying, look, there were 5 of those virgins who were prepared. They were ready when they first showed up. Then the bridegroom delayed his coming. But when he finally came, they had extra oil. They were ready and they went in. But there were some who weren't so prepared. And they got shut out. And so in summary, he says in verse 13 of Matthew 25, watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour, wherein the Son of Man cometh. One day we will be judged as to how we handle these temptations that came through Satan's eyes at an opportune time. When we were the most vulnerable, how did we do? Because he is still looking. He's going to keep on looking. And he's going to keep on watching for that opportune moment. In your life, when is a good time for Satan to move in? When is the time that you see yourself the weakest and realize, I've got to be careful? Sometimes individuals, there's all different sorts of scenarios that will present themselves. And which ones of those can Satan choose to use as a way of trying to take a child of God and lead them down a wrong road? He's going to watch. I think of a few passages that the Scriptures give in warning to that. Over in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and going down to verse 5. He warns about the idea of a couple not staying together as tightly as they should. He says, defraud you not one the other, except to be with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again. Why? That Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. He may see your super busy schedule. He may see extended periods of separation as an opportune time to do what he can do to mess up a marital relationship or to pull somebody into immorality. How about moments when we are stressed to the max? There's so much that we've got to do. We've got so many things going on. And then a few of those things kind of fall through the cracks and we become discouraged that I wasn't in my best and I didn't get this done and I didn't get that done. And so we began to say, well, I just need more time to get my work done. And so service to the Lord begins to trail off. I have to miss more services because I've got more of this to do and more of that to do. And I just haven't got time for the Lord anymore. That's kind of the situation with Elijah over in 1 Kings 19. Whenever he felt like he'd done all that work to try and stop Jezebel and kill the prophets of Baal up at Mount Carmel, but then when Jezebel came after him with the vengeance, he was in a cave. And God said, Elijah, what doest thou here? Why are you hiding? Well, sometimes when we get so overwhelmed, that's exactly what we want to do. We want to close the door, crawl in a hole. We want to do anything to get away from the pressure and the strain and all of the expectation. Satan's watching for an opportune time. Exactly what's going to be your trade-off. What are you going to stop doing to try and remedy that problem? Or maybe it's when we're angry. Sometimes we kind of lose our cool. And in the process of that, we wind up saying things and doing things that later we will deeply regret. Paul warned the Ephesians about that too. Maybe those fits of anger is the opportune time that Satan's been watching for. In Ephesians chapter 4, verses 26 and 27, Paul says, being angry and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath, and neither give place to the devil. That has opportune time written all over it. We can get pulled into these situations when we're not thinking clearly. And as a result, we can make wrong choices. Now, there is something encouraging here as well. And that's the idea that we think about Satan always watching. And yes, he does. But the scriptures also tell us that as with Jesus, after he withstood him in the wilderness, Satan left him for a while. Not every single day is necessarily one of those when Satan's after us with a vengeance. It may be more some days than others. Over in James chapter 4, going down to verses 7 and 8, James says, "Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded." He's going to be back. We know that. We've established that. But Paul also told the Corinthians we're not going to be tempted above that we're able to bear. Sometimes God sees that we're reaching close to a breaking point, but he knows that that's not where we want to be. And help can be on the way. I think that's one of the advantages of our worshiping together as we do. It's an opportune time for us to dismiss the cares of this world and focus back on the spiritual. It's also in this time that it can be an opportune time for good. It may be that there are some steps you need to take to make your life right in the sight of God. To be baptized for the remission of your sins or to come back with you straight away. Now is the accepted time. Now is the day of salvation. The scriptures tell us you can make things right with God even today. And if we can help you, won't you come? As together we stand and as we sing.
Why do you wait, you sinner?
Oh, why do you tarry so long? Your Savior is waiting to give you a place in his sanctified throne. Why not? Why not? Why not come to him now? Why not? Why not? Why not come to him now? Why do you wait, dear sinner, to gain by a further delay? There's no one to save you but Jesus. There's no other way but his way. Why not? Why not? Why not come to him now? Why not? Why not? Why not come to him now? Why do you wait, dear sinner? The harvest is passing away. Your Savior is longing to bless you. There's danger and death in delay. Why not? Why not? Why not come to him now? Why not? Why not? Why not come to him now?
Song to focus our minds on the Lord's Supper will be number 9. Number 9. Sorry about that. Voice is cracking. Sing all three. All
we come together, all we sing and pray. Here we bring our offering on this holy day. Help us, Lord. Help us, Lord. Help us, thy love to see. May we all in truth and spirit worship thee. May we keep in memory all that thou hast said. May we truly worship as we eat the bread. Help us, Lord. Help us, Lord. Help us, thy love to see. May we all in truth and spirit worship thee. May we all in spirit, all with one accord, take this cup of blessing, given by the Lord. Help us, Lord. Help us, Lord. Help us, Lord, thy love to see. May we all in truth and spirit worship thee.
We now come to the Lord's service, the taking of the bread and the fruit of the vine. In 1 Corinthians 11th chapter, we see Paul addressing the church of Corinth, addressing them about a problem they were having, telling them how they should partake of the Lord's Supper. He said, when you come together, therefore, in one place, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in eating, everyone taketh before after his own supper, and one is hungry, and another is drunken. What? Have ye not houses to eat and to drink in? Or despise ye the church of God, and shame them that have not? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I praise you not. For I have received of the Lord that which I also delivered unto you, that the Lord Jesus, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he brake it, and said, Take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. And after the same manner also he took the cup, when he had supped, saying, This cup is the New Testament in my blood. This do ye, as oft as you drink it, in remembrance of me. He has given us an example of how we should do that. We should take the bread and fruit of the vine. We now have the bread, which to us is the body of Christ. I ask brother to give thanks for the bread.
Father, we Lord in heaven, so grateful for giving us opportunity together here on this first day of the week. Set before us now the bread of Christ's body, hung upon the cross, forgiveness of our sins. We just want to give thanks and realize the great sacrifice that was given on that cross. We can approach you like this. We're just so grateful for everything. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.
We also have the fruit of the vine, which to us is Christ's blood. That's for the skipper to give thanks for tonight.
Blood of our Savior upon the cross. Lord, be with each and every one of us who take this. We may thank that great sacrifice Jesus gave to us. We do this in light of this, most happily with our pastor and faithful.
In 1 Corinthians 16:2, he tells us, upon the first day of the week, that every one of you lay by in him a store, as God has prospered him, that there be no gathering shall not come. We now have an opportunity to have baskets around the auditorium, place your offering in. Is there any other announcements that need to be made this time? Anything at all? Anything needs to be said? Not after a verse of song, that's Brother David to dismiss us.
We'll go ahead and sing the first verse of 661. Y'all stand. Then we'll have our dismissal prayer. Take the name of Jesus with you, out of sorrow and of woe. It will joy and comfort give you. Take it, and wherever you go, precious name, oh how sweet, oh what birth and joy of heaven. Precious name, oh how sweet, how sweet. Oh, what birth and joy of heaven. Father, we thank you for another beautiful day. Thank you for the opportunity to give us some updates to the church and truth. We pray, Father, that you dedicate faith in accordance to our will. The hope is